Ignorance is a void. It's an absence of knowledge. It's nothing. But if the void is infused with conviction, blind belief, brainwashing, and fear, it grows and moves up through the emptiness and then emerges as pure crap.
If you date a sample of known age, I mean, you know how old it is, like the tree ring. Carbon dating doesn't work.
Spurious assertions like this can be attributed to a mix of faith, wishful thinking, and ignorance, or it could be something worse. It's possible that Hovind, Stein, Cameron, and others aren't as ignorant or as stupid as they sound. It's quite possible they've read a couple of science books and know that what they're saying is crap, but they're deliberately lying to gullible fundamentalist audiences. So this new series, Debunking Creationist Junk, will look at the various lies, myths, and misunderstandings that creationists like to spread about science and bust them. Most of these fundamentalist preachers, of course, have no science training, whatever they like to pretend. There is an excuse for delusion and ignorance, but there's no excuse for deliberate falsification. So to kick things off, I want to announce an annual award for the most brazen breach of the Ninth Commandment by a creationist in his or her attempt to discredit scientific facts. The winner of the Golden Crocoduck will be announced every year on October 28th, the day of the patron saint of lost causes. So post clips of the most brazen lies you can find, either as videos or in the comments forum. And creationists, if all you've ever heard are science lessons from these mendacious fundamentalist preachers, then maybe you'd like to try to stump me with a persuasive piece of evidence, and let's see where the information comes from, and if it's correct. To help me count the number of lies throughout this series, I've got the ultimate judge with me here in the studio, God himself. Hi, God.
Hello.
God's got his finger on a buzzer, and he's going to give this sound every time he hears a breach of the Ninth Commandment, thus taking each of our lucky nominees one step closer to hell. In the unlikely event of a creationist actually getting a fact right, you'll hear this. And we have a host of cherubs in the studio ready to giggle with derisory laughter whenever a nominee says something hilariously stupid. This first video is just a snapshot of some of our nominees, along with a few examples of what might win them the coveted Golden Crocoduck. And of course we start with the man who has no science degree but claims
I taught high school science for 15 years.
Kent Hovind.
Back in 1949, an article came out in Natural History magazine that said the lower leg of a mammoth dated 15,000 years old, but the skin dated 21,000 years old.
Hovind cites what appears to be a scientific paper, but in fact he simply copied the information from a book by Walt Brown. How do we know? Because when he copied from Brown, he also copied Brown's mistakes. The carbon-dated samples weren't taken from the same mammoth at all, but from two different mammoths. Hovind is trusted as a reliable source by many people, even though, as we'll see in this series, he's one of the biggest fabricators in the urban myth factory. So the Fairbanks Creek mammoth myth has been copied again and again without any checks as to its veracity. Even when an urban myth is just too weird to be credible, it still does the rounds without anyone stopping to think, that just doesn't sound right. When I heard from numerous creationists that scientists had drawn an entirely new species of ape on the basis of a single tooth, I just knew this had to be another piece of propaganda fiction. For one thing, paleontologists deal with fossils, and that's what they draw. I've never seen a reconstruction or a recreation in a scientific paper, only in the popular press. Secondly, how can any paleontologist in his right mind know what an entire skeleton looks like on the basis of a single tooth? Something had to be wrong with this story, and of course it turned out to be pure invented crap.
Nebraska man. They created an entire skeleton with arms, legs, feet, hands, even facial features, when all they really had was one tooth, which later was found to be the tooth of an extinct pig.
Here's how the myth got started. In 1922, a paleontologist, Henry Osborn, found a fossil tooth in Nebraska and erroneously thought it belonged to a hominid. 5 years later, another paleontologist correctly identified it as that of an extinct pig. So why all the fuss? Well, soon after the discovery, a French artist drew a picture of what he imagined the alleged ape might have looked like, and it was published in the Illustrated London News. Osborn himself reportedly called the drawing a figment of the imagination of no scientific value and undoubtedly inaccurate. So no scientist or science journal has ever drawn or described an ape from a single tooth. But of course, facts never get in the way of a good creationist myth.
For example, Nebraska Man was reconstructed, family and all, from an extinct pig's tooth.
We have the case of course, the well-known Nebraska Man, made out of nothing but a pig's tooth, as they drew the picture of the ape man and his wife with all these details of how they looked.
Of course, if you repeat a lie often enough and loud enough, people who don't know the difference will assume there's got to be something in it.
Not one transitional form has been found.
There are no transitional forms. Those transitional forms, those in-between stages, are still missing.
No intermediate fossils have ever been found. Carbon dating indicated live snails had died 27,000 years before.
Shells from living snails were carbon dated at 27,000 years old.
Mammoths have been found with food still in their mouth, still in their gut, that is tropical vegetation.
The evolutionary textbook, you'll still find this. They're claiming that whales evolved legs and became cows. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
We ought to see cats, we ought to see dogs, and we ought to see cogs and bats. Back in 1999, if you do the research, you'll find that a Chinese farmer glued together the head of a bird and parts of a reptile and completely fooled the worldwide scientific community. If you do the research...
Good idea, Kirk. If you do the research and don't just listen to the creationist rumor mill, you discover that this fake didn't fool the scientific community at all. In 1999, Stephen Surkas, an American sculptor and amateur fossil collector, bought the specimen at a fossil fair in Tucson, and it looked significant. Two respected paleontologists, Philip Curry and Xing Zhu, agreed, and National Geographic magazine, which is not a scientific journal, ran a story on it. But apart from Curry and Zhu, all the experts were skeptical. The scientific journal Nature rejected Surgas's paper on the find. Storrs Olson, curator of birds at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., declared it a fake. When Surkas tried to publish his paper in the scientific journal Science, two peer reviewers also declared it to be a fake, and the paper was again rejected. Now, how is it that a fossil is endorsed by only two paleontologists, but called a fake by experts, called a fake during peer review, never described in any scientific journal, and rejected by two scientific journals? How can this be described as something that
completely fooled the worldwide scientific community?
If that's not a breathtaking distortion of truth, then Moses needs to go back and get another version of the Ninth Commandment. The fact is that the exposure of this fossil is a great example of how science works. It ensures that claims are checked for accuracy. It ensures that mistakes are minimized and corrected as soon as possible. It's sort of the complete opposite of the way the creationist rumor mill works. Who's there to peer review these creationist claims? Who fact checks? These claims aren't subject to the stringent controls of scientific tests. The only rules seem to be read something, half understand it, make the rest up, and assume that because you're doing it to promote your religion, it's okay to lie. Maybe science, with its caveats and degrees of certainty, is difficult to understand compared with guys who sound absolutely convinced they're right. Or maybe people are vulnerable to something that creationists have and scientists don't. A threat.
In the book of Romans, chapter 1, the Bible tells us that the evidence that God has created is so obvious from the things that God has made that if you reject that evidence, you are without excuse.
The threat that if you don't believe what I say, you'll burn in hell forever is a potent weapon. Science can't compete with that. The threat has been the weapon of choice for priests in every major religion since the time of the pharaohs. Science can only appeal to reason and common sense and point to evidence. It can encourage you to learn about the world around you, but you have to figure out for yourself that childhood scare stories are not a real threat, and no harm will result from using your intelligence. Maybe, just maybe, this series will expose the people who are threatening you as fearmongers and liars. Well, let's see.